Alright, here we have our second video on political geography. Why do boundaries between states cause problems? Let's take a look. Why does the shape of a state matter? Well, first off, how do we get the shape of a state? Well, we have to create something called boundaries, and these are invisible lines that mark the extent of a state's territory. So, how can shape affect a state? Well, first off, it can create problems with communication and conflict between neighboring states for a variety of reasons. The ease and difficulty with internal affairs, let's say from one portion of a state to another, can be problematic, and the social unity among a state can also be problematic depending upon its size. Let's keep going and talk about the 5 basic shapes of states. Let's first start with a compact state, which is defined by the distance from the center to any boundary around it that does not vary significantly. Usually it's defined by smaller states, and the capital is almost in the exact center. Poland is a great example of this. Yes, it's not terribly small, but nonetheless, it is almost the exact definition of what a compact state looks like, where the capital almost in the middle, and no matter which direction you go from the middle, it's almost equidistant. Another basic shape is an elongated state, which is a long and narrow country, which usually suffers from internal communication because of the length between, let's say, the north to the south or the east to the west. The ends of the state are often in isolation because, once again, capitals are usually located in the middle, as you can see here with this example of Chile. A third is a prorupted state, and this is a compact state with a large protruding extension. So here are the reasons for that protrusion. It's to access resources, aka water, or it's to separate 2 states that share a common boundary. Just depends. A perfect example is the Congo. It does not need to have that extension, but because it wants to gain access to the sea, that protrusion is now included within the state's boundaries. Our fourth is a perforated state, and this is a state that is completely surrounded by another. These types of states depend economically on its surrounding state, clearly because they cannot access, let's say, the sea, where import and export is most common. Perfect example is Lesotho, which is located in South Africa. I've circled it for you right there. Our last basic shape is called a fragmented state, which includes several discontinuous pieces of a territory. Here are 2 kinds of fragmented states. One is a state that's separated by water. Here we have an example of Indonesia. You can see that Indonesia expands multiple islands and obviously is separated by water. Our second type of fragmented state is a state that is separated by an intervening state. I just talked about the Congo and how it is a prorupted state because it wanted to gain an advantage to get to the sea. Well, by doing that, it actually separated the country or state of Angola, and you can see there where Angola is literally separated by the Congo's protrusion. Alright, let's talk about landlocked states. These lack a direct outlet to the sea, and they are completely surrounded by several other countries or country. Here it's most common in Africa, and the reason why is when Africa was taken over by European nations, well, they built railroads, and so they didn't have to worry about going from one country to the next because usually they controlled both of those countries. So hence, it's most common in Africa. 14 out of the 54 states are actually landlocked. And clearly, just like we talked about with a perforated state, landlocked states depend on other states economically to access the sea for imports and exports. Alright, now let's talk about boundaries. How are these states created? Well, there's 2 different types of boundaries. One's a physical one, which you're probably familiar with, which is a significant land feature, let's say like a mountain that delineates a state's boundary. Another, which now you're probably more familiar with because we've been talking about culture so much, is cultural characteristics between states that delineate boundaries such as religion or language. Here are some examples of physical boundaries. A desert is a perfect example. In North Africa, the Sahara separates many different states. For example, Algeria, Libya, and Egypt. Second physical boundary is a mountain. Now, if you look in the South America map, you can see that the Andes separates Argentina and Chile, which is a great example of a mountain boundary. Our third example is Lake Victoria, which is a natural boundary that separates Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. Alright, cultural boundaries. Let's first talk about what a geometric boundary is. It's a straight line drawn on a map to delineate a boundary. Literally, it was easiest to draw a straight line instead of figuring out, is there a physical boundary? Is there a cultural boundary? So, one great example is the boundary between the United States and Canada. I've circled them for you in that map. Literally a straight line. Second, cultural boundaries, religious. And these are only in a few cases throughout the world, but the best example I can give, which I've given before when we talked about religion, is that Pakistan and India were split up by Great Britain because Pakistan is majority Muslim and India is majority Hindu. And our third cultural boundary is language, and this is most distinct in Europe. After World War I, the primary reason for redrawing many different states/countries within Europe was primarily due to language. Boundaries within states also occur. So these boundaries are often drawn to separate nationalities, ethnicities, and even provide a political advantage known as gerrymandering, which is actually illegal in the United States today. Now, ethnicities who don't have enough power to gain control of national government are often given localized government instead. I'll give some examples. Here are two approaches to this. One is a unitary state, and these places put the most power in the central government. So it usually works in states that have few internal cultural differences and a strong national unity. And this is most common in Europe and within smaller states. I'll give you two examples though. Monaco and China. A federal state is another approach, and this allocates strong power to the units of local government, and it's usually more suitable for larger states. For example, Canada, Russia, and the United States. Think about the United States with smaller subdivisions of states, let's say like New Jersey and New York. They allocate power to those local governments to run those localities. Now, another example is Belgium, a very small state, but nonetheless, when we look back at the definition of why boundaries are inside states, is due to, let's say, ethnicities. And here we have Belgium separated by two different ethnicities. Okay, that was it. Another quick wrap up of states and political geography. We'll talk much more about this in class. I will see you then.